And welcome to our Mint Press live stream. Thank you so much for those joining us today. Today we are doing an urgent live stream to break down and talk about what exactly is happening in Jerusalem at Al-Aqsa Mosque with the recent Israeli military raid on Al-Aqsa. I'm sure many of you have seen the many viral videos that are online showing Israel targeting and attacking worshipers. And so that's what today's discussion is going to be about. So we're just going to give everybody just, about a minute to join our live stream. And if you could help us beat social media algorithms, we always ask that you share this live stream wherever you can, you like it, and you hit the subscribe bell if you have not already. And so thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Mnar Adley. I'm the founder and director of Mint Press News. And so we're going to get started. So as many of you have probably already been following, the Israeli military has raided the Al-Qibli Masjid at Al-Aqsa while attacking Palestinian worshippers in Al-Quds, Jerusalem during the holy month of Ramadan. Again, it's almost like we're having deja vu from last Ramadan in May. So the Israeli military has basically invaded the mosque. This is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's one of the holiest compounds for Muslims in the entire world. And through this invasion of the mosque, the Israeli military has shot tear gas, stun grenades, rubber bullets, sound grenades as well, at unarmed Palestinians while they were praying during Ramadan, hitting people with batons that were trying to escape. Many journalists have been shot at in the head, including Al-Qastal journalist Nasreen Salem. And the Israeli military has been completely out of control with their attacks against Palestinians, targeting medics, journalists, women, people just passing by, the elderly. And so I'm just going to share one quick video just to show how this whole thing got started. And we're going to bring in our guest in just a moment. Let's see here on Palestine, this one. This is a video of how it basically all started when Israel raided the mosque, when people were praying inside.
حاصرين بالأقصى احنا حاليا حاصروا كل الشباب اللي اقتحموا المسجد القبلي بالوقت الأقصى مخطوط وقنابل فوق All
right, so as we can see from this video, the Israeli military began to detain people who were worshiping and people who started to defend themselves and start throwing rocks at the Israeli soldiers. And so we want to go over what has provoked this entire thing and just get straight from the very beginning of how this entire thing and this form of violence happened and what provoked it at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, because I just can't begin to imagine if some viral videos came out showing Russian troops invading a holy church in Ukraine, what those kinds of calls would be by the international community and media. So today we're joined by Dan Cohen. He is an investigative journalist with Mint Press News and Behind the Headlines, their Washington, D.C. correspondent. He is an amazing, very talented documentary filmmaker. He produced a documentary, Killing Gaza. He's traveled to Jerusalem. He has documented much of the settler violence in an upcoming documentary for Mint Press that will take us inside the temple movement and their plans to destroy Al-Aqsa. So he is very much an expert on this subject matter. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Mnar.
So let's start from the very beginning with a flyer that was shared by the temple movement that basically provoked this entire situation to happen at Al-Aqsa compound, where they were promoting the idea of doing sacrifices at Al-Aqsa mosque.
Right, exactly. So this is the, let's see if we can see it. Yeah. So this is the flyer that basically started this latest escalation off. It's the idea. I mean, basically, what it says is that this movement, this kind of wing of the temple movement, will actually pay Jews to attempt to bring an animal to the Al-Aqsa compound, what they call the Temple Mount, what is known to Jews as the Temple Mount, to sacrifice an animal. So you get like 400 if you know, I can't remember exactly what it is, but basically it's like 400 shekels, which is the equivalent of like a little more than $100 for bringing an animal, and then it's 10,000 shekels. So, like two and a half, $2,800 or so if you actually manage to sacrifice an animal up there. Um, so the whole idea of this flyer is to provoke, um, and the idea of bringing an animal to sacrifice at Al-Aqsa is a provocation, and they know it's a provocation, and that's why they do it. And it doesn't have any basis in um, modern Judaism, what Orthodox Judaism does today and hasn't for thousands of years. And so, we'll get into that later. This kind of like, is this Judaism? What is, what is this an expression of Judaism or Zionism or both? And I'll explain a lot of that later because it's kind of can be very confusing for people. Um, if you look at the figure on the top left of that image, his name, that's a guy who I've actually interviewed. You'll see in the documentary. His name is Raphael Morris. He is the son of British settlers. He speaks pretty decent English because his family's from the UK. So he is the founder of a group called Return to the Mount, that's their logo on the bottom left of that image. I know it's kind of hard to see because it's poor quality and it's just small on the screen, but um so this group is called Return to the Mount. It says, wait, people are saying the screen is dark. Why is the screen dark? Now someone says can see it now. Okay. Can you see it, Mnar?
Yeah, I can see it just fine.
Okay.
I mean, it's a little small. It's a little small, but I think
Yeah, exactly.
you can see it.
Maybe I can zoom in on it. Does that make it bigger?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, so that made it a little bigger. So yeah, this group is called Return to the Mount. Return to the Mount is basically a group of, you can call them extreme right wing, you can call them ultra nationalist, you can call them fascist. I call them apocalyptic settlers. I think that's the most accurate term. And it's not only settlers, as in in the West Bank, or Golan Heights. These are these people live inside Israeli. It's inside all Israeli controlled borders across Palestine. So they're settlers in the sense that the whole thing is. But again, you can call them whatever you like, ultra nationalists, whatever. But I call them apocalyptic because that is their actual goal. They ideologically and practically seek to initiate an apocalyptic end times war, which they believe Israel will come out on top, because God will intervene on its behalf, and so this is basically what sparked this latest escalation, this latest Jerusalem unrest. Call it what you will. I mean, we always we hear the term clashes, and obviously that's a total whitewash, which I think we can talk about media coverage later. But
Yeah.
so the provocation is they distribute this flyer, and these things are distributed all the time. I mean, but this is a major high holiday. So the reason they want to sacrifice animals is because it's Passover or Pesach, which is when Jews commemorate the biblical story of leaving Egypt, slavery in Egypt. So This flyer goes around. Palestinians catch on. They see it on on social media, and then they basically say, "Hey, look, these settlers are going to try to take over Al-Aqsa, trying to go sacrifice an animal up there, which is forbidden in a number of ways, not only by the letter of the law, because according to the status quo that Israel abides by, that actually Israel imposed in 1967, Al-Aqsa, not only like the mosque or the Dome of the Rock, the entire Al-Aqsa compound, that whole outdoor area, is an Islamic worship space only. So others are free to visit. So Jews, whoever, are free to visit according to the law that Israel imposed as the occupier in 67, but no one is allowed to worship there. And animal sacrifice, is the form of worship that Jews use in antiquity. It's no longer a form of sacrifice, and that I will explain a bit later. Or I'm sorry, it's no longer a form of worship. It's completely antiquated in Judaism, but by the Israeli occupation's own law, only Muslims can worship there. No one else is allowed to worship in any way. You're not allowed, Jews, Christians, whatever. You're not allowed to mumble prayer. And so this whole idea of sacrificing an animal is to go up there and kill it and smear its blood around in this thing for the glory of God. So Palestinians see this and they say, okay, these Zionist fanatics are coming to try to sacrifice an animal up here, which they're not allowed to do, and we know the Israeli state is not going to might even allow that, or they don't know. And so they say, well, we have to defend Al-Aqsa. And so you have particularly young men, young guys in particular, but not only. I mean, all kinds of people, all ages, men, women, who basically, bring rocks, bring whatever they can to basically throw at settlers when they come in to do this kind of stuff. And so the Israeli occupation ignores the provocation and uses it as a pretext to then storm the mosque and basically attack, and like the video we just watched, use extreme force, extreme brutality, arrest all kinds of people, beat them, chase them, journalists, medics, whoever, and then that escalates, snowballs, into what is now happening, that there are reports of rockets coming out of Gaza, and so this can basically is sparking another even potential mega assault on the Gaza Strip. So all of this, what may amount to thousands of deaths of civilians, Palestinians in particular, pretty much only Palestinians or nearly only Palestinians, what this all comes back to is this flyer and the activities of this apocalyptic right-wing movement that is supported by the state, by the Israeli government, and has broad support, is not only supported by the Israeli government, but has broad support in Israeli society itself. So that's basically how we got to this point.
And I want to talk about the Temple Institute, which is kind of where all of this goes back to, which was founded by a man called Ariel, Rabbi Ariel. And I have a clip here that I want to show. Actually, I think we'll share the clip later on. But in terms of the Temple Institute, it's basically funded by the Ministry of Education inside of Israel. It has a lot of support from Western politicians and even nonprofit charities here in the United States. And how they indoctrinate the children, Dan, I know you've done some reporting on this, is that they make this part of the education system from kindergarten. And it has always been feared that because they're indoctrinating children at such a young age, this kind of can create that violent mentality towards Palestinians from a very young age. And I know that you have done some reporting inside of Jerusalem where you've interviewed people, really young people, educated people, Israelis, and you've interviewed them, and they have said very openly, the quiet part out loud, because they have been indoctrinated by the Temple Institute and the Ministry of Education inside of Israel, where they openly advocate for violence against Palestinians and annihilation of Palestinians. And a lot of these people that you interviewed were like American, like New Yorkers, or just American Jews. Very obviously, they're Zionists, and they're promoting like genocide against Palestinians. So what exactly are they teaching kids at such a young age? How are they doing this indoctrination to promote the sort of violence that we're seeing at Al-Aqsa today?
Well, the Temple Institute is a key part of this. It is, as you said, founded and run by a man named Rabbi Yisrael Ariel, who's one of the most extreme right-wing rabbis in the country. He basically he's overseeing this entire operation. And basically, the story of Rabbi Yisrael Ariel is this. In the 1980s, he led a group of youth who attempted to dig a tunnel into Al-Aqsa from the side, and then basically tunnel through, and then they'd come out on top, and they thought they would take it over. This was, they were caught. And what happened is the Yisrael Ariel got off basically free, but he realized that you can't go up against, the whole state. I mean, even if they'd gotten up there, okay, then what? Then they're taken off, and it's a lot of probably a lot of violence, but it's not going to fundamentally change the situation of what it's not going to lead to what they want, which is a total theocracy, completely ethnically cleansed of all Palestinians, of all non-Jews. And so he decided we have to take over the country from within. Now, that basically coincided with the same strategy in the 80s that the settler movement used overall. So they basically decided we're going to take over the country. We're not going to try to, fight it from the outside. We're going to take it over from within. And
So I have a quick clarification I would like you to make. Did he and his group not have full support from all of Israelis?
No, definitely not. Look,
Right.
in the 1980s, the idea of building a temple, of destroying Al-Aqsa and building a temple, was very marginal, even among the settlers, because you have to understand how Judaism understands what is the Jewish, what is the Temple Mount to Jews. We got to go back to a bit of ancient history in order to understand, this reality that we're in today. So in 70 AD, the second temple was destroyed. Basically, we're going to fast forward through some Jewish history. The second temple was destroyed. Jewish tradition teaches that it was at the site of what Al-Aqsa is today. There's no hard proof of that because they can't do an archaeological dig for obvious reasons, because there's a mosque compound there. It seems very likely that's the place, but there's no hard evidence. But nonetheless, that's where Judaism teaches that's where the temple was. So 70 AD, the temple is destroyed. Okay, so Judaism, until the destruction of the temple, was basically a sacrifice cult, like many other sacrifice cults throughout the region, where you have your god that you worship through sacrificing animals, the best animals without any blemish, and that animal, it's like an offering to God that makes God happy. Okay, so the temple is destroyed, you can no longer do those sacrifices. So when the temple was destroyed, it was basically an ultra right-wing uprising of the Jews that led to its destruction against the Roman Empire. And so this, tiny people trying to rise up against this empire, inevitably they got smashed. It didn't go well for them. And so the temple was destroyed. And Judaism changed forever. So instead of being a sacrifice cult, it becomes, instead of sacrificing animals, the form of worship is prayer. That's where the concept of prayer comes from. And so it becomes internalized. Jews, start spreading out throughout the country more. There's still some Jewish study. Judaism isn't outlawed or banned or anything, but you can't sacrifice animals up there anymore. And so because of the devastation that Jews suffered, the priests, who were the heads of the whole thing, and led all the sacrifice and were basically like the CEOs of the temple, they no longer had that position. And you have the rise of rabbis, who were basically just teachers. That's what a rabbi is, a teacher. So the rabbis are basically tasked with saving Judaism. And so they say, okay, no, we are not going to try to rebuild the temple. We cannot actively take in any part of that. We're not going to all en masse come and live in Palestine and all this, So basically, the rabbis banned what they called messianic activism, trying to reestablish a Jewish kingdom with a temple and a king and sacrifice and all this stuff. So for 2,000 years, this is how Jews lived. They prayed, that someday God will make this happen. This total we have to live in passivity. We can, live in different countries and interact and this and that, and pray and, be pious, but we cannot do anything to make this happen. That it'll just happen when God chooses it. God's choosing, and anything to advance that process is completely forbidden. In fact, stepping onto the Temple Mount, what Jews call the Temple Mount, is one of the most grave sins in Judaism. So all of those soldiers, those heavily armed soldiers going up there and beating the hell out of a bunch of Palestinian worshipers, according to the laws of Judaism, they are to be punished with a divinely imposed death sentence. It's just one of the most grave sins any Jew can make. Same with those settlers. This is according to the traditional view of Orthodox Judaism. Okay, so total passive approach. So then comes along Zionism. So Zionism is basically
and Zionism is based on a secular ideology at its core. It's not actually based on religion.
Right. Well, it's European nationalism. So basically, in the 19th century, you have all these European revolutions. Eventually the French Revolution. Basically revolutions sweeping across Europe, and the Jews of Europe are basically, where there was anti-Semitism, are saying, well, we should separate as a nation. And it was actually, I'm sorry, the Zionists. They were a tiny fragment. Most Jews did not believe this. In fact, basically all Jews were Orthodox at this point. There was no like secularized Jews, like me, or that didn't exist yet. So Zionists say we have to separate from everyone else and build our own, become a separate people. There's the French, there are the Germans, there are the Italians, and we are the Jews. So they see it as a nationality, not as a religion. And the Zionists, the early Zionists, wanted nothing to do with religion. They thought it was a completely antiquated concept. They're like, we're modern Europeans, and we're just, we don't want anything to do with, these like, Jews living in the shtetl, living in the village, and this kind of thing. So they wanted to create a new Jew, which was basically using like fascist ideology to create this new strong Jew instead of this, weak old Jew. And so Zionism was not popular among the people. Most people rejected it because they saw it as, wait a minute, you want to go and build a country and have, all of this stuff. That sounds like messianism. That sounds like what the rabbis told us was forbidden, what's been forbidden for 2,000 years, and only God is supposed to do. And so most people just rejected Judaism. They saw it as like as false messianism. And so the thing is, Zionists were able to create powerful connections with politically powerful people, because there was a lot of anti-Semitism among the elite. And so they could basically say, look, if you want to get rid of Jews, here's a great way to do it. Facilitate us going over there, going somewhere else. So at this point, Zionism is basically secular. You have in the late 19th, early 20th century, you have a few religious people who are starting to think, maybe there's something to this. Maybe instead of being passive and following the old way of doing it, we take an active approach. We
Yeah.
use these secular ones to actually build the kingdom, and then this is what we do, and then we take it over, and we've actually created this um, um, like this theocratic state ourselves. So basically, there was a tiny fragment of religious Jews who believed that, and they became religious Zionists. And that essentially is what Yisrael Ariel draws on. I mean, it's a much, 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 much more extreme version. Basically, over the decades, since the early 20th century up to the 1960s, 70s, 80s, that ideology until 1967, when the occupation started, that ideology was extremely fringe. But with the occupation of the West Bank, Golan Heights, Egyptian Sinai, et cetera, the religious Zionists think this is God making it happen. Like, this is a holy state. This is this state of Israel is an instrument of God's power. And so then they in the 70s, they've basically occupied this whole area. They took over East Jerusalem, where Al-Aqsa is, and they're like, this is it. This is happening. And then all of a sudden, you have Camp David. Israel withdraws from the peace accords, withdraws from the Sinai. And then there are these agreements with the Palestinians and the Jordanians to have like shared control. And so for these fanatics, it's like, this is completely unacceptable. And it was earth shattering to their ideology to say, well, wait, this is the state of Israel is an instrument of God's power, but all of a sudden it's going in reverse. What is this? So some of them rationalized it, said, well, 2 steps forward, 1 steps back, 2 steps forward. Okay. And others said, no, we have to actually like force it to happen. We have to will it. So Yisrael Ariel, then a young man, and a handful of others decided the only way to stop this this withdrawal from the Sinai and this peace agreement from taking, which they believe is land that God gave them, is to destroy Al-Aqsa and take it over. And so there were a number of plots to bomb Al-Aqsa that were nearly successful. There was one attack by an American guy from Baltimore whose name escapes me at the moment, where he went in and shot a bunch of people. He shot several people in the rock. He managed to smuggle a weapon in. There was another episode where an Australian set the Dome of the Rock on fire and caused some damage to some very ancient things. Some very ancient artifacts inside the Dome of the Rock. And then there were several plots to actually blow up the Dome of the Rock that, I mean, you see this stuff in the documentary. I have interviews with people who were involved with it and security officials and this kind of thing. But Yisrael Ariel, this rabbi who heads today's Temple Institute, decided, he, after his plot using youth to go tunnel into Al-Aqsa, after that failed, he decided, okay, what we need to do is take over the state of Israel, and specifically through the education ministry. And so he created this Temple Institute, got a little bit of money from the government. And over the years, it has grown. And now it's heavily funded. One of the key funders actually is a guy named Simon Falek, who owns the duty-free empire. So whenever you go to these airplanes and go buy duty-free, that's who you're funding. You're buying from this guy Simon Falek, who funds the Temple Institute as well as a bunch of settlements and these kinds of things. Ultra right-wing Israeli Zionist organizations. And so, yes, funny name, I agree. So Simon, so Yisrael Ariel's Temple Institute has just grown and grown. And I mean, under Naftali Bennett, who is now the prime minister, when he was the education minister in, 2014, 2015, 2016, around then, he poured huge amounts of money into the Temple Institute. And so they would create curriculum teaching children to long for the temple, to desire the temple. Again, I mean, I just want to stress this is totally at odds with any kind of normal, healthy form of Judaism and how Judaism has existed for, 2000 years. So this is not like we're just teaching people to be more Jewish. It's like, no, what they're doing is actually teaching people to be more nationalist under the cover of Judaism. And this is what Zionism has always done, is use the mythology and the symbols of Judaism for nation building, and the nationalism always comes ahead of the religion. They will rewrite the religion, to the point where they say you have to go to the Temple Mount and do this and that, where for Orthodox Jews that's completely forbidden. That's unthinkable. And there's so many Orthodox Jews who think that way, though it's slowly changing. So Yisrael Ariel's Temple Institute is indoctrinating generations of Israeli children to basically want genocide, where you have a theocratic state with not a single Palestinian, Muslim, or Christian left inside. And so those interviews, Mnar, that you mentioned, going out on the street, well, that's the impact of not only the Temple Institute, but just the Israeli education system in general, just raising children to, raising the next generation in a really horrifying way. So that's some history and the Temple Institute. And you can actually, the Temple Institute, if you go to Jerusalem, you can go on tours. They'll take you on tours, and they have all these artifacts, and you'll see what the priests, what they think the priests looked like 2000 years ago, and all the instruments. And they've spent enormous amounts of money on recreating. I mean, they are actually trying to create artifacts for a new temple. So it's not just like we want to teach people how the temple was. We're preparing for the new temple. So for example, they have a huge menorah that is on display kind of in like a square near the Temple Institute in the old city of Jerusalem. And that thing costs $1 million. I interviewed the guy who made it, and this artist, and it's very serious money and very serious work that goes into it. So it's very dangerous.
And so year after year now, we're seeing this escalation at Al-Aqsa now, where what used to be a fringe group, as you described, is now basically become the mainstream establishment group inside Israel. And figures like Netanyahu, for a long time, promoted himself as not necessarily supporting this group, but I think he was supporting the group from the background, behind closed doors. And in general, we are seeing now this escalation that will eventually lead to Israel bombing Gaza. I think that's what's really on everyone's minds right now is, how can we prevent this escalation? But in fact, they want this escalation. And the United States, is okay with this kind of escalation because Israel is a proxy for the military industrial complex. It's a proxy for the weapons manufacturers. And so more war in Gaza, where Biden, like last year, he was able to just sign off and approve personally $650 million worth of weapon in the middle of a massacre, in the middle of Israel, leveling residential neighborhoods, targeting water treatment facilities, targeting buildings where Al Jazeera and other journalists were housed, completely targeting pregnant women, children, giving families, barely any time to escape their homes. Again, where would they escape? We're talking about, Gaza being the largest open air prison in the world. It's a major ghetto. And so what do we see happening that could take place next? I was reading this morning that Gaza has fired a few rockets, literally maybe just in the hour right before this live stream started. What do you think is going to happen next, Dan?
Well, it's impossible to predict, but it could escalate to any level. I mean, this is kind of a similar um, dynamic to what we saw just about 1 year ago. I mean, last May, um, basically you had fanatical settlers who were agitating at Al-Aqsa and in the occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, and Hamas put out basically an ultimatum telling the Israeli government to withdraw your forces from Al-Aqsa, and or we will open fire. And the Israelis declined. And so Hamas made good on its promise, and Israel responded. And of course, extreme, I mean, I don't even like to use the term disproportionate, because there's nothing that's, proportionate. There's nothing proportionate about bombing a caged, ghettoized population. And anybody who knows anything about the Gaza Strip, like you said, people don't have anywhere to go. It's one of the most densely populated places in the world. So there's no proportional amount of bombing that I think that is legitimate. But that went on for, I think, 11 days, killed several hundred people, and essentially accomplished, for the Israelis, actually, it was quite embarrassing, because they said that they'd be able to stop the rocket fire and, achieve their goals, and they weren't able to. And they had to come up with a series of lies. And then for the Palestinian armed resistance, for Hamas's armed wing, the Al-Qassam brigades, they were able to basically intervene in Jerusalem, which is pretty remarkable. I mean, for, a group that basically has manufactures its own weaponry, and then, gets some stuff smuggled in from Iran, but has no, real military, so to speak of. So to speak, I mean, compared to one of the most heavily armed military in the region, it was basically a stalemate, where Israel just kept bombing civilians and taking out civilian targets, but they couldn't actually stop rockets being fired. And so, I mean, if you look at, if you account for weight, the difference in power between the two, I would say it was a Palestinian victory. And so now it's a similar dynamics happening again, where you have a provocation coming from Al-Aqsa, you know, these ultra Zionist groups coming from Al-Aqsa, and agitating, and then Palestinians, starting to respond. They start to respond. Israel, uses extreme aggression, and so now basically it's comes down to, what will Israel do? I mean, they have the power to stop or not, and of course the so-called international community. And the international community doesn't really exist. The international community is basically, the United States, which has its proxies all over the world and its vassal states. And no one's gonna send arms to Gaza like they are for Ukraine and the, neo-Nazi Azov battalion. So nobody's gonna send manpad rocket launchers to take out Israeli F-16s, like they are for Ukraine and its Nazi infested military. So anything can happen now, and Palestinians are very much on their own. And civilians, if there's another real kind of major attack on Gaza, civilians are going to pay an extreme price. And the thing is, this is what happens year after year, and I think it's really the untold story of Palestine. I mean, one of the things I find with Israel Palestine, the reporting on it, it tends to be the same situation. It hardly changes. The crimes of occupation on a daily basis, the suffering of Gaza, and this kind of thing. But there are no reporters that are willing to talk about one of the main factors driving the periodic bouts of extreme violence, which is the Temple movement,
Right.
and their activities. And so, I mean, we can look back at 2014, that major war on Gaza. A lot of that had to do with attacks on Al-Aqsa. 2001, or 2000, the Al-Aqsa, it was called the Al-Aqsa Intifada. When Ariel Sharon went to Al-Aqsa and basically that was, a huge thing and set off an intifada. And then in actually I can show here. I'll show this thing in 2012. This is pull this up. Here's another flyer. This is a flyer that went up and was distributed in 2012 by a couple members of Knesset, Moshe Feiglin being one of them, who is back in the Likud, and then Yehuda Glick, who is also he's not a member of Knesset anymore. And he was a member of Likud, and so this flyer calls to basically ethnically cleanse the enemies of Israel from Al-Aqsa. This thing was caught by Palestinians. They saw it, and it basically sparked, you know, I mean, they basically prepared for whatever was going to come, and then it turned into, another crackdown. That was 2012. 2014, I mentioned 2015 and 2016. I was in Palestine in those years, and we saw a major attack. Um, Basically, fanatical Zionists, their activities around Al-Aqsa sparked what some called the Car Intifada, where basically Palestinians use cars to hit settlers and soldiers. There were stabbings. There were all kinds of summary executions. I mean, it was just absolutely, Israeli soldiers and settlers executing Palestinians. So, and again, I'm going to show all of this in the documentary I'm working on. um, but it's the same thing year after year. In 2017, that was a bit different, because in 2017, that's when what happened was there were a couple Palestinians from Al-Fahm in kind of the north of, whatever, 48 Israel, call it what you want, but who went and opened fire on some occupation soldiers at Al-Aqsa. And Benjamin Netanyahu tried to install metal detectors for Palestinians, and this is a Palestinian site, and so they rejected it. And what was remarkable is they used mass unarmed protest, and basically boycotted the site until the metal detectors were removed. And it was just incredible because it was actually effective. I was denied entry to Palestine, so I couldn't be there. I was in Jordan at the time. Um, but I mean, it was incredible how Palestinians organically organized throughout Jerusalem, um, and basically were able to shut down the Israeli occupation and force Netanyahu to withdraw those metal detectors. And so it's like every year or so, there's some kind of, provocation around Al-Aqsa that usually leads to mass Israeli violence against Palestinians. Um, and, it's just this dynamic that no one will report on. I mean, there was Haaretz had a report about that flyer that was kind of the trigger that provoked, this current round. Haaretz talks about it. So you'll find some liberal Zionists who will talk about it. But, in terms of foreign media, the Washington Post or the New York Times or any, they will never touch it. Of course, they will just say, clashes, Jews who want to pray at the Temple Mount, and, they clashed, and security forces clashed with Palestinians. So,
Yeah.
that's basically the dynamic. It's just there's no way to know where this could go. A lot of it, kind of depends, I think, on Israeli internal politics. Netanyahu has used these these things to boost his own status, but it's like when an Israeli prime minister gets involved in a war or whatever it is, it usually goes well at first, but they're never able to accomplish their stated goals. They're never able to stop rocket fire, whether it's from Gaza or whether it's from Lebanon. So they'll just kill a ton of people and destroy all kinds of infrastructure, but then they'll just arbitrarily declare victory and say, they won. But that's usually the dynamic. So I think a lot of it depends on internal Israeli politics. And right now, Naftali Bennett, the prime minister, I mean, I haven't followed it extremely closely, but I know basically one of the key people in his coalition and his party pulled out. So his coalition is kind of on the is not looking very strong. So that could be a reason that he would want to, have a real war on Gaza, because he thinks maybe it will do good for him, but again, just impossible to predict how it goes.
Well, a lot of people always ask, why can't this conflict end? Where is the international community when it comes to, Palestinian human rights? And, it just goes back to what I was saying before with that Israel and this whole conflict really is fueling the military industrial complex for multiple nations, including the United Kingdom and the United States. And so that's why we're going to continue to see the United States stand with Israel no matter what, as this kind of warfare escalates. I mean, one of the most interesting things that happened, I guess it's not that interesting or even shocking, is when Susan Rice was the US ambassador at the UN, and she was vetoing any sort of investigations into, or calls for investigations into Israel that was openly sniping medics, journalists, and just unarmed civilians protesting and marching towards the Israel-Gaza border because they were protesting the illegal blockade where humanitarian aid, food, medical supplies have been blocked from entering. And so as long as the United States reigns supreme around the world, Israeli apartheid will continue to expand and escalate, just like the United States supported South African apartheid. And even after the United States vowed to end its support for apartheid, it continued to sell weapons to South Africa, behind closed doors. So really, it just goes to show just how powerful these weapons manufacturers are and how much power and influence they have. And, again, their power and influence expands throughout our media, through these think tanks. And so really quickly, on the note of clashes, I just want to play this clip really quick, and then we're going to go back to Yisrael Ariel and his clip. But this is how the media is portraying what's happening in Palestine. And it just goes to show just the hypocrisy in the way that things are portrayed in comparison to, let's say, if this was happening in Russia or in Ukraine, where Russia was invading or bombing or raiding a religious place of worship. So we're going to play this.
تفرجوا قنبلة على الأبواب.
I mean, I just want to play this part right here where this pushes that elderly man. I mean, this is the face of Zionism. This is the face of Israeli occupation. And our media, from the New York Times, the Washington Post, Reuters, NBC, they continue to portray and frame that what's happening in Jerusalem as clashes. And I just want to talk about the New York Times really quick. The New York Times is, very much working in coordination with the occupation. For example, the New York Times bureau office in Jerusalem was built upon an ethnically cleansed Palestinian family home. The New York Times literally ethnically cleansed a Palestinian family so that they could build the Palestine, their bureau office in Jerusalem. In addition to this, one of their main correspondents based in Jerusalem, I mean, their family members and I believe their son, I forgot her name, Dan, you might remember who I'm talking about, but their son is in the Israeli Defense Forces, like in the IDF. And so you can't expect...
Isabel Kirshner.
Isabel Kirshner? Okay.
Yeah.
I forgot her name, but I was following her for a long time. But you have like even the New York Times bureau chief cannot give us even a neutral, even just any sort of objective perspective on what's happening because they work hand in hand with the state of Israel. And I want to show next the clip from Rabbi Israel Ariel. You really
let me say one
oh,
one more thing on media bias. I mean, this
yeah.
just is like the cherry on the cake. The there's a German publishing giant named Axel Springer that owns Business Insider, among others. It owns Politico, so kind of big mainstream U.S. media outlets that requires an allegiance to Israel. You have to pledge
Mm.
allegiance to Israel to work at these mainstream media outlets. So, I mean, you can just imagine, like, what if you had to pledge allegiance to Russia to work at, I don't know, the New York Times or whatever. So it's just like you're not allowed. I mean, I don't even know. It's just so crazy. It's just so insane that you have to pledge allegiance to a foreign state that is, practicing apartheid in order to be able to write articles. So, no wonder we're seeing. I mean, that's the extreme example, and what you just described with the New York Times is so wild, and this stuff is all known, but it's like it doesn't matter. They just still pretend that they're impartial and that these clashes are between two equal sides.
Well, and when it comes to social media, we have to remember that um, Facebook created a so-called free speech court where Emmy Palmore sits on that free speech court board, and she is an official Israeli state censor. I mean, she was responsible for the deletion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian posts documenting Israeli war crimes, and they targeted poets, and they targeted just artists, young people posting online showing what Israel is doing. And we have today like celebrities like Bella Hadid. She's a very well-known model who is of Palestinian and Dutch descent, and she's been using her platform to talk about what's happening in Palestine at Al-Aqsa Mosque and just about Israeli occupation in general. And she has been talking about bringing attention that her Instagram page has been censored. She wasn't able to post certain things, and obviously both Facebook and Instagram are taking down posts. They are shadow banning Palestinian posts showing any sort of Israeli violence against Palestinians to make sure that the whole conflict and crisis is framed from a pro-Israeli perspective. And of course, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, is one of the monitors for YouTube that are monitoring content. I mean, this is an organization that the FBI once designated and called and said that posed a security threat to the United States and acted as an intelligence agency to the state of Israel. And the ADL is who went really after Ilhan Omar when she brought attention to the Israel lobby's power in the United States. And so all of these things combined, and of course we have the Atlantic Council, which is directly funded by NATO. It's also funded by the state of Israel. It's also funded by multiple weapons manufacturers and also by the state of Saudi Arabia. This is sitting, working with Facebook to monitor content, to point out, what is so-called fake news or not fake news. And so I want to go back, Dan, to the Temple Institute, to its founder, Rabbi Yisrael Ariel, who you gave a really good explanation about his background and how really it was a fringe movement. But part of his ideology is, the Temple Institute's ideology is that they actually are not just trying to cleanse the state of Israel of all Palestinians and Muslims, but also of Christianity as well. And they want to take over the entire Middle East and create like this, this Jewish state. It's a very similar ideology, I would say, to the extremist groups that belong in ISIS, who also say, that they're Muslim, right? They say that they claim that they're Muslim, but obviously their ideology comes from it's a nationalist political ideology that I believe was influenced very much by the West, by the British Empire and by the US Empire today, to push that, to cleanse all of the Middle East of anyone that's not Muslim. But of course, the people that they target the most are actually Muslims. They've ethnically cleansed many Muslim communities. So I'm just going to play this clip really quick, and you can tell us more about it. So this is just a short clip, part of a video that actually Dan Cohen and David Sheen put together.
Wait, you can't see the subtitles. We're in the way. Maybe if we do it like that. There we go.
Can you hear it?
מעכשיו בשלבים של המצודנו. זה תפקידו של מלך המשיח. להביא את העולם כולו למציאות של המצוות. אז זה לא עניין למשפטים, זה עניין לביצוע. פשוטו כמשמעו. ולכן אומר הרמב"ם, שאם אתה פוגש בן אדם ברחוב, שאיננו שומר של המצוות, אתה, יתקף ואומר, אם יש לנו כוח, אתה צריך להרוג אותו, אתה צריך להרוג עליה. אם אתה תופס את דבר ברחוב, ואתה אומר לו, אתה שומר של המצוות, וכן הלאה. סליחה? בשביל זה יש רמב"ם. בשביל זה יש רמב"ם.
I think you can pause it there.
אם אחד מאיים...
So this guy, Rabbi Israel, just called for the assassination of Barack Obama.
Yeah, and Obama awarded Israel Ariel with a bunch of money from NGOs in the U.S. and some more. And on his final, one of his final acts as president was to sign a giant weapons contract, $3.8 billion per year for Israel. So, actually, I mean, so I recorded that. This was in 2015.
Yeah, tell us how did you record that?
So, Yisrael Ariel is part of what's called the Sanhedrin. What they claim is the Sanhedrin, which is in the times of, messianic times when you have a Jewish theocracy and kingdom and everything. You have a king, and then you have a council of sages that advise the king. And so him and some other fanatical rabbis created this this council. They're kind of rebirthing this council, and so they had a meeting, and I was able to go inside.
Wow.
And so, because of my name, because Cohen is priest in Judaism, and so it's like the highest, like, holy name. So they think I'm like some, that it conferred extra, holiness because I was there.
It's like the Sayyid concept with Muslims, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I went into this meeting and I started. I was filming just with my camera, and then my camera died, and I was just recording with my phone. So this is audio recorded with my phone, and he just, it was a couple hours we were sitting there. And then he just started speaking. He basically explained how you carry out a genocide. And, anybody who wants to can go watch. I mean, that's an edited down version. But, it's almost 7-minute long explanation of kind of how you carry out genocide. I mean, they call it conquest. But what you do is you go from city to city and conquer them. And you basically say, do you want to live in peace? And if they accept what are called the Noahide laws, which are basically laws that non-Jews have to abide by in order to live, among Jews, then they allow them to live. And if they refuse, then you cut their head off with a sword. And he basically says, do what you want with the women, which he's saying you can rape women. So that's, he goes into detail about it. He talks about conquering. He even mentions we're going to take over Iran, Turkey, Syria. So all of these countries, of course, Lebanon is part of that. It's, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, parts of Saudi Arabia, they see as theirs. So it's very much like ISIS. I mean, just basically twin
it's
ideology.
The same thing.
Complete same concept.
Well, and what's so interesting is that this Temple Institute and the people that push this ideology goes against like what Christian values are here in the United States. Yet we see like the Christian organizations backing this sort of end of times prophecy and supporting this sort of extremist political ideology that would result in the deaths of Christians and the persecution of Christians as well. And so could you explain how this is like kind of a catch-22 kind of situation for Christians here in the United States who do support Israel's Zionist movement and then this particular group?
Well, so I mean, Christian fundamentalist support for Israel is largely based on the idea of Christian Zionism, which Zionism was actually originally a Christian idea. I believe a Protestant idea of basically the Jews have to all return to Israel in order for the Messiah to come. That Messiah will be a false Messiah. Then the real Messiah will come and battle him, which will be Jesus. Jesus will come and battle the false Messiah and defeat him. And then there will be, a period of where there will be a Christian kingdom, is the idea. So, I mean, the thing is, all of this stuff is shaped by politics, by economics, and this kind of thing. So, that's the kind of irony of it. Yeah, as you said, that it's like, you have Christian fundamentalists and Zionists, who are mostly really nice people here in the US who, are basically want to see Palestinian Christians ethnically cleansed, and Christians, and Muslims as well, ethnically cleansed from the entire region in order to like advance this crazy prophecy. So yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot of, I mean, I don't even know if you can call it hypocrisy. I guess it's hypocrisy, but it's just, sheer, I don't know, it's horror to me. So, yeah, I mean, that's basically the idea in terms of, Yisrael's video. So yeah, I mean, it's that's the ideology that that's what they say behind closed doors. We caught them behind closed doors. And
you would never see this clip play on any mainstream outlet ever.
No, I mean, we published it, and I, tweeted about it, and I thought, well, they're calling to assassinate Obama. Maybe like the Secret Service will reach out to me or something like that. But it was, nothing. So it's like, I mean, they can literally say anything they want. They can say we should kill the president, and it's fine. They're allowed to say that. And for whatever censors that are watching, I'm not saying, I'm quoting someone else. So
right.
So yeah, I mean, it's just, Israel can just basically get away with anything. And that guy's, I mean, some are tempted to say, oh, he's just some, crazy rabbi in the corner. No. He's funded by the state. He's the guy writing the curriculum for the education
for the
ministry.
Kids. Exactly.
Yes, exactly. So there's if you want to, learn more actually about how the education ministry functions, I did a piece for Mondoweiss in like 2015 or so, where I interviewed the Haaretz education correspondent named Or Kashti, who, he basically just broke down the how the education system is used, but has basically been taken over by this ultra fanatical element of Israeli society, where even like right-wing leaning religious people were being pushed out and were made uncomfortable. So it's not, it's just this tiny extreme fringe that is totally taken over and is, indoctrinating generations of children into, just pure unadulterated genocidal hatred.
And can I just add here that it was a group of younger Israeli settlers that kidnapped I think he was 15 or 16 at the time, Muhammad Abu Khdeir from Jerusalem, Shafat, which, by the way, I just happen to know their family personally. And so that story really hit close to home. But these settlers, these Israeli settlers, kidnapped this young teenage boy. They doused him with gasoline, forced him to drink gasoline, and they burnt him alive. They lit him on fire. It was such a horrifying story, but that's just how much hate and violence and just that genocidal thought process that is being indoctrinated into these people. It's so scary to think that like our politicians stand behind this group. Our
You know, one
political,
of the
yeah.
let me say, like the murder of Muhammad Abu Khair. I was there at the time, and I got to know that family quite well. There are a couple things. There was I'm struggling to think of the name, but one of the political figures who basically incited that violence. I'm really struggling to think of his name. I have his stupid face in my mind, my memory, but anyway, he's a member of the Jerusalem City Council, and he's a prominent politician in Jerusalem to this day. The other thing, he basically, he used kind of code to call for, revenge attacks against Palestinians. And that's what was carried out. That was seen as revenge. Then there, the so the three people who carried out that attack, who murdered Mohammed Abu Khair, who basically drove up early in the morning, about 4 in the morning, when he was sitting out front of his house, waiting to go to the mosque and pray during Ramadan. It was one man who was, I believe, 29 years old, and then two like teenagers who
Very
he basically
young.
got to
Yeah.
go with. Yeah. So the guy who the guy who led the thing. So this is a thing that's not really talked about much in Western media about Israeli society. That guy was not he's not from a religious Zionist background. He was not like a Yisrael Ariel fanatic. He was just a regular kind of Orthodox Jew. And the sad truth is that, while you have people like Yisrael Ariel, who are ideologically fanatical, who have this whole crazy theology that they've, kind of taken from previous generations of religious Zionists and made more extreme, and, this and that, you also have just the nature of living in an apartheid state where you are a ruling master class, and you are also religious people. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to group all religious people together, but like religious Jews in Israel tend to be right wing. They tend to be very right wing. And so they have become very much just as racist and hateful as, the hardcore religious Zionists. And that was a perfect example of it, because the guy who led that attack, like I said, was not a religious Zionist. He came from a very traditional Orthodox Jewish family. And so that's kind of one of the more troubling things. Basically, Zionism is leading Judaism, is deforming Judaism into this, just ultra nationalist. Even for people who are not ideologically taking part in it, just the reality is shifting to the right all the time. And that's a perfect example of how Zionism is deforming Judaism.
I want to pull up a picture of Muhammad Abu Khair just because I feel like we should remember his face and we should remember his name. Obviously, we should remember all of the Palestinian children that have been killed, been targeted and attacked. Get his picture over here. And the two Israelis that were behind his murder apparently were jailed, but I think they weren't they later released, Dan? Like, there really wasn't any real consequences for his murder. I mean, there was international outrage over it because the story went viral. But yeah, go ahead.
I think the kids did get off easier. I'd have to look to see what exactly their punishment was, but yeah.
But this is him. I mean, this is Muhammad Abu Khair from Shafat. He's the Palestinian teenager that was kidnapped by these Israelis. He was doused with gasoline, forced to drink it, and they burnt him alive.
Yes.
It's a really tragic story. I mean, completely tragic.
Yes. and then they proceeded to basically to kill 2,200 more Palestinians in the Gaza Strip right after that. So yeah.
Yeah, and what we hope is that we don't see another escalation in Gaza, because Gaza is obviously the largest open air prison in the world, as we mentioned before, and people there are still recovering from last Ramadan's massacre that Israel committed. I mean, I was reading that over 70,000 people. Can you imagine? 70,000 people are homeless right now in the Gaza Strip, in the world's largest open air prison and ghetto in the world. They barely have access to any sort of clean water. I know the water there has become basically like sewage sludge, not for everybody, but in certain areas, because their water treatment facilities are not working properly, their electric grids are not working properly. The UN estimated that by 2020, which was 2 years ago, that Gaza would not even be inhabitable. I mean, that's crazy to think that we're 2 years beyond that. Israel still continued to destroy and level out Gaza. And here we are today. And you did that very beautiful documentary about killing Gaza. Can we play a trailer for that?
Sure. Yeah, let me pull it up. I mean, yeah, what you said about Gaza is, I mean, completely accurate. Yeah, the UN said that several years ago, and then 2020 came and went. And the thing is, Gaza was already unlivable. you
Yeah.
know, I mean, people freak out if their electricity in the U.S. They freak out if their electricity is off for, 15 minutes. But there you get, a couple hours of electricity per day. So, um, let me see. Let me just find this.
And
Um,
I think something while you're looking for that video that's important for people to remember is just the plight of the Palestinian children. We talked about how Israeli, children are being indoctrinated to hate, to be filled with this kind of hateful ideology that's genocidal. And it really, really is scary. And by the way, Miko Peled was supposed to join us today. Unfortunately, he canceled at the last minute, but I was hoping that would be something that he could talk more about, because he actually was in the Israeli military. He's a contributor to Mint Press, and he served in the IDF, and now he's obviously doesn't he's anti-Zionist, and he goes actually back to Palestine and he protests with Palestinians. But something that I think we should remember is just the plight of the Palestinian children. Right now, there are over 1,000 Palestinian children, if not more, that are caged inside Israeli jails, not even being charged for any sort of crimes or anything like that. In Gaza, Dan, you documented the suicide rates in Gaza, because there's just all hope has been really lost for the people there.
yeah, I mean, it's just an incredible crime that, Gaza exists in this state, and, continues to, and people somehow continue to live through that. And I mean, basically what you described is a few hours of electricity a day. When you turn on the faucet, you get basically salt water, because the aquifers have been drained by Israel. And so you also have a huge amount of people living off relatively, very small amount of resources. So, I mean, it's just life is just intolerable there. And so, basically all of the young people who had a chance to have escaped and, have gotten out, um, and, look for life abroad in the US or Europe or Australia. And then they, basically usually don't feel at home there, because they miss, their home of Gaza and their family and what they know. And, know that their family is suffering at home. And then when Israel bombs it, it's incredibly painful for them. So, I mean, it's just an intolerable experience. But yeah, I mean, in 2014, I went into Gaza with Max Blumenthal. And we filmed for several days during the last week or 10 days or so of the 51-day war on Gaza. And then I continued to go back, and I spent maybe 7 months over the next 2 years, filming inside Gaza to show kind of what it was like after the, after most of the Western journalists left, and I just wanted to show what it's like to live under siege in the aftermath of this kind of rubblescape. So everyone, I mean, now the documentary is free to watch online. It's on YouTube. It's on Vimeo. I mean, you can also watch it on our website, killinggaza.com, for like $5. You can download it, but we made it free last year. So, but here's the trailer just so everyone can see. I'm going to make this full screen. There we go. Here we go.
July 2014. Israel invades Gaza. Everything was a target. 100,000 homes destroyed. Towers bombed. 551 children killed. After 51 days, the war ended, but the terror continued. Deprivation, exclusion, a grinding siege with no end. We followed the people of Gaza during the war and throughout its devastating aftermath, watching from the ground as they kept up their resistance. Coming soon, a film on life under siege and the killing of Gaza.
I remember
Yeah,
watching part of this documentary and just like it was so beautifully made that I felt sick to my stomach. I mean, I know it's a weird thing to say, but like it really documented and just showed the true reality of what was happening on the ground and just the emotional aspect of how people were truly living, something that we in the West, especially living in the United States, can never truly relate to. You know, I, as a Palestinian American, have lived under Israeli occupation and apartheid in Jerusalem. I lived in Shafat, and I witnessed so many human rights abuses, and I, lived under the apartheid system. But what Gazans are going through is by far nothing even Palestinians living in the West Bank and in Jerusalem can even relate to, because they are just completely cut off from the rest of the world. It's so devastating to hear their stories.
Yeah, I mean, it's just unfathomable, and I mean, it's just that it never fundamentally changes. Is just kind of it's the hardest part to wrap my head around, honestly. The fact that it's like, I mean, now I've
Do you have PTSD from that? Because like just watching the
No, I don't. I mean, no, I do not. But it's like when I just think about, that I haven't been to Gaza in 5 years almost, and pretty much everyone is still there. So,
yeah.
I mean, it's just hard. It's just hard to wrap my head around the fact that it just goes on and nothing fundamentally changes. Though, what does sort of change is the, armed resistance's ability to kind of deter Israel. But, that doesn't fundamentally change the obviously the quality of life for the people living there. It just means the resistance is getting stronger and more, capable. So, yeah, I mean, that's why it's important to just, continue to talk about this and not let people forget. And so I think it's good we're doing this.
So just as we wrap up today's live stream, we really appreciate everyone joining us. And we really appreciate the super chats and all the donations that we received. We received a lot of really positive feedback, Dan, from all the great information that you've been sharing. And this, fringe movement turned establishment, turned mainstream, the temple movement. We've been covering this issue and this story for actually the past 5 years or so. So we have a really great investigative series written by Whitney Webb. It goes through much of the history of this movement. I think it's a 2 or 3 part series. It's pretty thorough. So I really highly recommend everybody going to Mix News and checking out this series by Whitney Webb. We can link to it in the chat section. But also Dan is working on a documentary for Mint Press News. We mentioned it at the very beginning, but Dan, can you tell us more about the documentary that you're working on for Mint Press and Behind the Headlines about the Temple movement? I mean, you got pretty incredible access and footage that nobody else has, and we're really excited to share it very soon. But it's partially complete, but we are working on it. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so I was, the years I was there, I was able to basically embed myself in their activities. I would basically go back and forth between Gaza and Jerusalem, and a lot of the time that I was in Jerusalem, I would be around them, and these temple movement fanatics, and I got access. And so I've interviewed many of them. I've interviewed different politicians. I've documented their activities, um, and spent basically years studying to be able to kind of understand their the ideology, which some of which I kind of laid out earlier in the interview. That's just based on my research over the last years, and I've been back a couple times to film with them a few times since, and we're hoping to do one final reporting trip, to document them before this documentary comes out. But yeah, so I mean, it's I've never seen anybody really show what this movement is actually doing on the ground, and most crucially how they're responsible for just an incredible amount of bloodshed and
Yeah.
violence, and how they're becoming more mainstream, and have gained power. And so my documentary kind of takes a lot of what I've talked about in this live stream and puts it into film version, so people can really understand in a much deeper way, how dangerous they are, and where I mean, the thesis of the documentary is that Zionism is reaching its logical conclusion, and
Mm.
so that's what this group is. It's it's the end game of Zionism, and so they want to create an apocalypse, and they're very much intending to do it. And so that's what this it's I think of like Gaza as kind of living this apocalyptic nightmare, and so a lot of that it's like now we see this provocation that started with these settlers around Al-Aqsa creates bombs dropping on Gaza. And so it's like it's very much, they are creating an apocalypse for Palestinians. So that's, basically what the documentary shows.
And we have one more documentary coming up about Gaza as well, and it's about the resistance groups that won the war last year. I think it's really important that people support these projects. Tomorrow, we are actually launching a fundraiser to build support for these documentaries. And so, for those watching, we hope that you'll keep your eye out for that fundraiser so that you can support those documentaries. But we want to wrap up for today. Dan, was there anything else that you wanted to leave us with on this topic, or are we good to go?
I think we're good.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dan, for joining us and sharing all of your knowledge with us on this topic. And we obviously are all praying for peace and that things don't escalate. But for those that have joined us today, thank you guys so much, and we will be back online very soon. Thank you.